So it's my very great pleasure to hand over to Paul. Thank you very much, Paul. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Mill, and thanks very much for having me on again. I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks into the war that we did one of these sessions, and now we're into what is getting on to over 3, heading towards 4 months. I think many of us are hoping that somehow the war might have been resolved by now peacefully, but that isn't to be, and it's in a state of a very dangerous, a kind of violent stalemate. So what I thought I'd do is just sort of recap on what I covered last time, just for people who weren't able to come, and also just remind us of the perspective of what's been happening, and then take us through the last few weeks, and then perhaps try and think widely on what the implications of the war are. So starting broadly, sticking with the chronology, but then sort of branching it out at the end, because the war has implications for so many other things around the world at the present time. So just for starters, to remind us, basically this war in Ukraine developed as a direct result of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Basically, the Russian political context is really important here. When you had the breakup right at the start of the 1990s, the collapse was pretty rapid. First, the Soviet Union into the Commonwealth of Independent States. That still sort of exists, but never really took off. And you obviously had the post-Soviet world dominated internally by Russia as the largest country. That embraced the Western economic model. Free market capitalism was the thing, or market liberalization, market radicalization, if you like, another term. And there was talk then that it was really the end of history, that basically things were changing for the long term, very much in a Western model. And even China was starting to show a transition to what people were starting to call authoritarian capitalism. Now, in practice, when Russia under the first post-Soviet president, Yeltsin, took over, what you really had was a rapid transition, kleptocrats ruling, sort of turbo-capitalism or hypercapitalism, call it what you will, and a real sort of untrammeled free market. That resulted pretty quickly what amounted almost to an economic collapse. According to some figures, inflation peaked at something like 1,200% per year for a brief period. There were certainly many millions of Russians who ended up below the poverty line, about a third of the population. And you even had a pronounced effect on life expectancy, particularly for men for whom the problem of alcoholism became absolutely huge. And this really sort of lasted throughout the 1990s. But more important, I think, as far as the longer term is concerned, is the way that Russia as a state was treated with near contempt by people in the West. Basically, that coincided with the progressive expansion of NATO right through to the Russian border. And I remember back in the Soviet days spending time in Moscow. At that time, it wasn't so much the immediate states surrounding Russia, but the ones slightly further away within the Soviet Union, who were known as the near abroad. And essentially what was happening in the late 1990s and early 2000s was really the whole sort of encroachment, if you like, on Russia by NATO. Now, let it be said, the countries that were joining NATO were happy to do so. They still had a fear of Russia for the most part, not entirely, but NATO certainly was extremely keen on this. And I think essentially by the end of the 1990s, when Vladimir Putin took power, you had this sense that Russia had been treated extremely badly. And that still persists 22 years later, particularly among older Russians, people over the age of 40 or 45, who still hark back to some extent to the Soviet era. From the end of the 1990s, Vladimir Putin took over. His background was very much with the KGB, very much on the intelligence and security side. It coincided with Russia beginning to climb out of the economic mire, partly helped by relatively higher prices for oil and gas, its major exports. And essentially, Putin began in the very early 2000s to use the energy that was coming through to actually begin to rebuild Russia, and in his sort of phrase, make Russia great again. The very important thing he did in 2003-4 was really to make an example of some of the oligarchs and tame them, make it clear that they did not have the power. He had the power. They might have the money, but he at that time didn't have the power, and they had to know their place. And even in the short period where he was prime minister under Medvedev rather than president, he still really wielded the power. The key thing here, I think, is making Russia great again. There's much more to it than this in two senses. One, from about 2005-6 onwards, you began to see Russia operating more abroad. The brief war in Georgia, you had the developments in Syria, the Sahel, particularly in the Sahara, against ISIS and ISIS types. You had eventually, of course, Crimea in 2015. And essentially, the armed forces by this time have been largely rebuilt. And really, he was developing the power base of Russia, particularly looking to be involved abroad, outside of the near abroad even, which is one of the reasons why he went to aid Assad in Syria. And of course, one result of that is that Russia does have a small warm water port at Tartus in Western Syria on the Syrian coast. But behind this, just to finish on this little bit, you have the ideology. And it's, you can't go into detail in this, but essentially, you could probably call it crudely a kind of ethno-fascism with a Tsarist dimension. And essentially, this went really back to the old idea, pre-Soviet idea, well, early Soviet idea among white Russians in Western European capitals, that basically Russia had to be rebuilt with the idea of Eurasia, Russia leading a greater Asia. Much of this was down to the writings of Lev Gumilev back in the 1930s and 40s, even though he suffered very heavily under the Soviet regime. And more recently, the real guru is Alexander Dugin, who is much favored by Putin and the people around him. So essentially, this is the whole background. As far as war aims are concerned, well, the relevance of Ukraine, I think, you have to tackle it in with Belarusia. And the point is, I just want to remind us of the aims originally, which are very different to what actually happened, but we tend to forget that. Basically, what Putin was about was extending Russian influence very heavily towards the West. And of course, Ukraine was the way to do this. You already had Belarusia with a large country, but quite a small population. The Ukraine in land area, the second largest in Europe. And of course, more than that, it actually had a population of about 45 million. There's a very strong belief among people around Putin that Ukraine really was part of Russia. And it was necessary for it to come on board, so to speak. And there was an expectation right from the start that many Ukrainians would welcome that. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why the decision was taken to go for what was called this special military operation, or a partial takeover of the country. So that, in a sense, brought us to the start of the conflict on February the 24th. There were several specific aims at the time to remind us. One was to take Kyiv, the capital city, very quickly, you know, within basically 48 hours at most, with airdrops and all the rest, taking over a key airstrip, only about, I think, 20 kilometers northwest of Kyiv, and then fly in lots of troops, and then basically link in with forces coming from Belarus, and particularly take the capital city and, well, put it bluntly, get rid of the regime and replace it by an acceptable regime. There was more to it than that. They had to get complete air supremacy, not superiority, but supremacy. And they wanted to expand very quickly, both out of Crimea in the south, which they already held, but also these two, well, partial oblasts in the east, in the Donbass region, ones which had already sort of indicated that they were leaving Ukraine, although not going in with Russia per se. They wanted their independence. So that essentially is where we were on February the 24th. The problem was that right from the start, basically, the Russian planners, and Putin, I think himself, got it badly wrong. One was you just did not have the wide welcome that was expected. Very similar in a way to when the Americans got to Baghdad in, what was it, March 2003, expecting cheering crowds, and what they got was opposition all the way out to Baghdad. There was a complete misunderstanding of the attitude within Ukraine. There were supporters, but they were relatively few in number. So that was really got very much wrong. But also the original attempt to take Kyiv quickly failed. That original air landing at the Antonov airstrip failed because the Ukrainians were ready with a special brigade. And that actually took the best part of 2 days even to get the airport in Russian hands. By that time, it was too late to do this surprise attack on the city. And really from then on, things really turned very difficult for the Russians themselves, really for many different ways, I think. You had the misjudging of Ukraine, the forces themselves, the Russian forces that went in, and in total, in the days afterwards, there were about 145,000 of them, which in purely military terms was not enough to occupy any kind of country that was opposed to the occupation. They would have needed full-scale mobilization right across Russia to achieve that, but they did not expect that. And in fact, the large number of troops who went in originally only had about 5 to 7 days supplies, because the assumption was that the war would be largely over at the end of that time. So essentially that was another major mistake. The Russian armed forces were in fact very badly organized. They hadn't done the rebuilding that was claimed to have been done. There were internal problems for this. And overall, the end result of all of this was that the war was going pretty badly wrong, almost from the start. So much so that if the war started on that Thursday, the 24th of February, then by the Sunday, Putin was getting extremely angry and frustrated. And he had that speech in which he basically said, this is only happening because of NATO interference. And therefore, if NATO persists, then all hell would be let loose. The implication being that they would be prepared, if need be, to escalate to tactical nuclear weapons to keep NATO back. Now, it's true that even at the start, NATO was active. We do now know that there were many groups, including US Special Forces and British forces as well, training the Ukraine, and some of them have been doing that ever since the attack on Crimea, 7 years previously. So essentially, Ukraine was already much more connected than the Russians, and I think most people in the West even realized. So essentially, there was some truth in what Putin was saying, but even if the truth wasn't particularly complete, certainly within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the war starting, support of all kinds poured in from NATO, principally from the United States, the likes of sort of light arms, human portable anti-tank weapons, human portable anti-aircraft missiles, anti-helicopter missiles. They all flooded in pretty quickly, which really came to the aid of the Ukrainian army. And what this means was by the end of about 10 days into the war, the original war aim had been lost. And essentially, any idea of getting air supremacy over the whole country was gone. Any idea of taking the capital city was finished. And what you then had was a transition to heavy bombardment of the two major cities, Kharkiv and Kiev itself. And that was to continue for several weeks, while Russia also tried to expand its control in the Donbass region, again, with some difficulty. And if you go towards the end of the 2 months of the war, nearly halfway through where we are now, the position then was in essentially, as I say, a violent stalemate, but in a very difficult position for the Russians, not for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have taken very heavy losses. There have been many people killed, many civilians killed, millions of people displaced, both elsewhere in Ukraine and also abroad. And the human cost of that, the PTSD and the rest, is immense, particularly on children. I don't think we should ever forget that. It looks like, the majority of all children in Ukraine have actually been displaced to an extent in the last nearly 4 months. It's at that sort of level. And so from about, 2 months ago, and essentially the Russians gave up on the idea even of trying to take control of Kyiv, and they basically withdrew all their forces from that part of Ukraine. And so Kyiv, although it still gets the long-range rocket attacks on occasions, is not under artillery fire. Kharkiv is in part, but even less, that is less, because the Ukraine's army is actually being able to push some of the Russian forces back. I'm sorry I'm talking all about sort of military terms for what is actually a peace news webinar, but we can go on more to the wider implications shortly. And one of the things I think we have to look at now is that since about nearly 2 months ago, the Russians changed their war aims again and made them even more limited. That is, trying to grab as much territory as they could in Donbass. There've been really more issues coming to the fore. I'll cover some of the main ones now. We might want to come back to ones in the end. I've got another nearly 10 minutes. Essentially, if you're looking at the overall picture, let us take Russia first. Putin's regime has certainly been successful in suppressing an awful lot of dissent. There are some of the basically good independent news outlets in Russia. Almost all of those are being completely closed down, but some are operating abroad. There's some very interesting websites on what are from opposition groups within Russia itself. Within Russia too, you're also finding that there are ways in which ordinary Russians can manipulate the IT and the rest to be able to access information from outside. The control from the Kremlin is certainly not complete. There are other issues going on as well. It is generally true, and there are some polling groups in Russia which are regarded as usually accurate, shown by long-term trends. And one of those about 6 or 8 weeks ago suggested that about probably the majority of Russians still supported the war, mainly because essentially it could be said to be, Russia versus NATO, which to a large extent it has become. There's a very strong age differential in that younger Russians, by and large, are much more wary of what is happening and much less supportive. Older Russians, particularly over the age of 50, are much more supportive of Putin. And that seems to be persisting for really quite a long time. So there's that issue first. The second is that while there've been a very wide range of sanctions, they are not complete, anything like, and of course there's still being a lot of oil and gas being exported to countries otherwise opposed to what Putin is doing, and much more to elsewhere in the world. But sanctions are having an effect on everyday life, but more particularly some of the targeting sanctions which the Americans have organized are having a specific effect on some parts of Russian industry. For example, the subcomponents for some of these longer range missiles are almost unobtainable. And so stocks are actually running low already. And you're finding other sorts of problems there. The impact of sanctions is progressive, but pretty long term. In terms of doing irreversible damage to the Russian economy, as many people in NATO would like, that will take a very long time to happen. A second issue here is what is the attitude of China, the key ally, if you like. And here, I think more and more caution in Beijing, but at the same time, a fear that essentially this is becoming a war between NATO and Russia. And there is obviously the danger of Russia escalating, but there's also the risk from Beijing's perspective that Russia itself will become more and more weakened militarily and economically. As far as Beijing is concerned, that is not good news in the longer term for China. Whether that means that at some stage China will put more pressure, Beijing more pressure on Moscow, we don't know. Whether it would have an effect, we still certainly don't even know that. One other issue which I think is key, and this is very much at the human level, the Russian casualties on the war front have been huge. Nobody knows the real figures. The Russians say they're low, the Ukrainians say they're stratospheric. The reality probably, this is based on the kind of information which I think to some extent is reasonably accurate. The Russians have probably now suffered something like 20,000 young men killed, many of them in their late teens. And that is a vast number in such a short war. To give you a comparison, the total Russian losses through the Soviet losses throughout the nearly 10-year withdrawal from Afghanistan were a fair bit less than half of that, about 8,000 if I remember rightly. So in other words, these losses are very heavy. And it's worth remembering that as far as the Afghanistan war is concerned, it was very much the impact of those young people getting killed, not least on their families, especially their mothers, which basically sapped the commitment of, well, first of all, the Brezhnev regime, but more particularly the Brezhnev government, the Gorbachev government, to actually continue. And Gorbachev eventually decided to withdraw. That could happen here because, of course, one tends to forget be very blunt about it. In this kind of warfare, for every person who is killed on the battlefield, 2 are very seriously injured. So much so that they are not involved in the conflict afterwards. So we're probably talking about the best part of 50 to 60,000 young Russians either killed or really outside of the war. And that is a very big number, particularly when the total number of forces originally put in were of the order of 145,000. In fact, it's unbelievably high. And it's clear that the Russians are bringing in Syrians, Chechens, people from the Wagner mercenary group and others to try and fill the gaps. But that eventually will have an impact. When and how, I think we simply do not know. So really where we are now is a state of stalemate. We can look in detail at this in the questions, but really just to cut this bit short, we're now in a position where essentially there's no easy end in sight. And as far as one can tell, Putin is not willing to change and not willing to negotiate. Attempts are being made behind the scenes to bring the sides together. Turkey has been involved in quite a lot of this. The Ukrainians have made it clear they will negotiate and they will compromise. They won't compromise on control of their borders. And that is a very big sticking point. And I think Ukrainians by and large accept that to some extent, Crimea is done and some way will have to be found around that. There are all kinds of ways in which you can move on from this, going back even to the Minsk agreement of 7 or 8 years ago when there was a previous crisis, but it will not be easy. So really, we are stalemated, and unless there is some sort of breakthrough or change, I think particularly on the Kremlin side, then this could last really into next year, I'm afraid. May not do. But let's just finish quite briefly on some of the other issues. And there are 2 or 3 that I think we need to explore. Just remember my notes here. Yeah, I mean, one here is international attitudes to the war. There is an assumption that basically the Western world, so to speak, is in favor of what NATO is doing, in favor of the weapons going in and all the rest. And essentially, this is a good war, and the Russians are fighting the bad war. No ifs and buts, that is how it is. Now, I've implied it's somewhat more complicated than that, but let us always remember that the actual aggression came very much from Putin, and there's no getting away from that. And it was by no means that popular in Russia at the start. There's been such a clampdown on dissent that it's very difficult to tell what the mood is now. But the point about this is there's been this assumption that this is a good war. The reality is that this is not the way it is seen across much of the world. Some at political leadership levels, like Modi in New Delhi, and of course Xi in Beijing, but more generally among ordinary people. And essentially, I think what you actually see is not support for Russia and not lack of support for NATO. It's almost a kind of a plague on both your houses. And essentially, that's a wide mood across much of the world. There was, in fact, a major study which is published every year, which tries to get an idea of global attitudes. It's done by a range of, I think it's a consortium of polling groups, and it's regarded as a really very reliable source of information. That was published last Monday week, and that showed very clearly this kind of figure, that worldwide, there are very widely different views. You find it strongest in terms of suspicion of NATO and the West in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. There are several explanations for this, which obviously make sense. And if I was to put it this way, over the last, 20 years, the cost of war research program at Watson Institute at Brown University in the United States has been tracking the impact of the major wars, the majority of which, of course, were the very big wars fought under the banner of the War on Terror. And the figures, if I can just look for them quickly, between 2001 and 2021, they reckon over 929,000 people have died in the violence. Of that, nearly 400,000 were civilians, non-combatants. And in addition to that, and this is before the Ukraine war, 38 million people have been displaced from their homes. They list a US federal price tag for the wars as over $8 trillion. So we're talking about huge conflicts. And of course, most of the people have been killed have been people killed in the Middle East. They've been killed as a result of wars indirectly started by Al-Qaeda in 9/11, but pursued by the United States and its allies. And essentially we've seen, well, certainly 3.5 failed wars. I mean, Afghanistan we've seen disastrously last year. Iraq continues in a very bad state. Libya too. And even the air war against ISIS, you know, the one which was fought almost beyond the media between 2016 and 2014 and 18 largely, that war essentially has still resulted in ISIS spreading across the Sahel and elsewhere. And incidentally, in that war alone, hardly reported in the West, except when there were raids on Western Mosul, you actually had, I think it's between 60 and 70,000 people killed. And according to independent groups like Air Wars, that includes a good few thousand civilians. And that's in the very recent past. So if you look at that, you can understand a very mixed reaction from much of the global South when you get away from what is going on in the Western world. And of course, added to that, particularly in regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, people have memories of the colonial era and what was done then. So it's not straightforward in that sense, although it's really quite difficult to say that at public meetings unless they're to audiences who really are on board with what's going on. Other things very briefly. Yes, I mean, the problem is that we're in the early stages of not really knowing what the long-term impact of the war is going to be. We're already seeing major problems of inflation, which are affecting poorer people disproportionately. We're seeing the beginnings of serious food shortages, much yet to come, but some of the top UN people are saying this could be certainly as bad as the 1973-74 world food crisis. And I can remember that vividly because I've been working in tropical agriculture in years before that. And essentially that took millions of people very close to starvation. Fortunately, huge publicity did bring some degree of relief, and the much feared famine never happened. But we're now facing a much bigger problem because of disruption, not just from things like climate. I mean, the heat dome that Southern Asia has experienced in the last few, 2 or 3 months has been appalling. So much so that, in fact, India has banned exports of wheat, I think it's from mid-May onwards. And so you're getting very big shortages. You'll get problems with distribution of grain from Ukraine, which is one of the world's breadbaskets in the past as far as exports are concerned. So there's all that to contend with as well. And that really makes the overall position for many people in the world, frankly, a lot worse than if we hadn't had this war. Now, just remind you of one other thing, and that is, you know, we're talking about war all the time, but there's been a far greater loss of life over the last 2 or 3 years with nothing to do with war. And that, of course, is COVID-19. And essentially that pandemic already, and this is the new WHO assessment, has cost at least 15 million people killed. So that's 15 million people killed in basically a pandemic, which doesn't relate at all to the traditional idea of military security. It's much more on the human security side. So I suppose in a way, without just rambling on, we want to have the break and then get on to questions. This is really the time for rethinking what we mean at security. This is going to be very difficult because this is precisely the time when people are slipping into their old ways. And for the world's military industrial complexes, these are very profitable ways. And we're facing that as a really difficult global problem. We also do have the risk, slightly increased risk at some stage, that nuclear weapons will be used. The very fact that Putin has made these threats against an alliance which has its own nuclear weapons is actually something pretty new. And it takes us back to the dangerous times, going back almost to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But let me leave to that point now, so we've got plenty of time for discussions, disagreement, and I'll try and draw some conclusions at the end, but I won't make any promises on that.
We're going to start the Q&A now. I'm going to read out the last, well, one of the last questions, Paul, okay, which is the same question we had at the beginning of the last Q&A, which is, how great might be the risks of this war escalating into a nuclear war between NATO and Russia?
Well, I think within NATO, the view is you avoid this at all costs. The problem is if Putin in particular is really pushed into a corner, there is always the problem of some sort of accidental escalation at some time. There's an acronym which international relations people sometimes use, AIM, AIM, which stands for accidents, incidents, and mavericks. In other words, things in a high state of crisis can throw you over into something even worse. And that can happen rarely in the incidence of a nuclear confrontation if both sides, so to speak, have nuclear weapons. And that was one of the reasons why the Cuban Missile Crisis back in '62 was so concerning. The Able Archer misjudgment of a war game in, what was it, autumn of 1983, and also certainly at least one of the Indo-Pakistani confrontations. So it is possible. NATO, of course, has always had, or not always, since 1968, has had a posture of first use of nuclear weapons. It's MC-14/3, the basically known as flexible response. And that is essentially you would use a nuclear capability if you were losing a conventional war. Now you turn that on its head, and from Putin's perspective, if he was really to be losing and facing complete defeat in Ukraine, that is when the threats of a demonstration tactical shot would actually rise, and it would be under those circumstances that it would be particularly dangerous. We're not there. We're not there, I think, by a long shot. You can't be sure, because what happens behind the scenes is really pretty scary. I mean, some of the ways in which we were able to avoid a nuclear war over Cuba are astonishing. I mean, basically, one submarine commander, if I remember rightly, sort of not following orders. And certainly in the United States, one particular missile base, a new one, the people who were running it basically removed their connection with Washington, so that if they thought the United States was under attack, they would take their own action against the Soviet Union. We now know that that kind of thing went on, and it scared many of the participants rigid after 1990, when they met up with each other, both sides, and found out what had happened. So the danger is there. I don't think one should overestimate it, but it should remind us very strongly about the dangers that are intrinsic to nuclear weapons. It's one of many reasons why we should be moving to a nuclear-free world, but it's going to be even more difficult now than I think it was before.
Okay, so there were a number of questions, Paul, which related to how we get out of this. So they cover different aspects. So one was from Anne: what sort of exit route might possibly emerge from Russian, NATO, China perspectives? John asked, what could be an exit strategy for Putin? Douglas asked, can the UN's Uniting for Peace process be effective in resolving the Ukraine war and ending it? And then there's a follow-up question after that, also to do with negotiations and so on. But I wonder if you could respond to those ones.
Yeah, it's very much about exit routes, really, isn't it? I mean, I don't think at present that the UN Uniting for Peace can make very much difference. It's gone too far in many ways, I think, for that, sadly. In terms of exit routes overall, NATO, well, there are multiple problems. One is there are elements within NATO, and bluntly, elements within right-wing thinking in Western Europe and the United States in particular, that basically want Russia to be crippled as much as possible. They want it to be reduced to a state which can be no threat to the West. They see this as a golden opportunity to basically consolidate huge mistakes that Putin has made, consolidate on those mistakes, and really wreck the Russian economy and make sure it's no great threat to the rest of the world for some years to come. Now, those are small in number, but they are there, and they're active. They're often retired generals, often particularly right-wing politicians. But we shouldn't underestimate that. That is not the overall view, I think, within NATO, but other people may differ on that. It's certainly a dangerous aspect of it. So there's that element too, first. On the Russian side, I think where it becomes more and more difficult is if the Russians feel they are really being pushed into a corner, even to the extent of, as the Ukrainians now say they want, being evicted entirely from Ukraine, including Crimea. And I think if that was to be a possibility, that is when I think Putin's rhetoric on the nuclear side might rise quite strongly. And that, I think, is essentially a recognition, in a sense, of how this war is ending compared with what Putin expected. He expected that essentially the whole of the sort of Russian influence would move so many kilometers west, because it wasn't just Belarus out there, it was a much bigger country, Ukraine, out there as well. And in all probability, both Belarus and Ukraine would then be the basis for nuclear weapons. So essentially, that was what he was envisaging. It is turning out so differently that, if almost the opposite seems possible, then I think this is where we do move into dangerous times. We need to curb, basically, I'm blunt about it, people who are really very much on the warmongering side. And one has to remember throughout of this, that this kind of conflict is immensely good for the military-industrial complexes. What some people term, I think rather cleverly, the war-promoting hydras. These very large complexes, military-industrial, academic, think tanks, and all the rest, trade unions to some extent, all really seeing defense as absolutely crucial, but also, frankly, pretty profitable as well. And for groups like that, you do not particularly want a war like this to end. In fact, a war which is fairly low level, but using up an awful lot of arms, is actually good for the armorers. So there's that element as well. Beyond that, I think there are many people who really are far more concerned with the dangers really imbued in this conflict. It's actually potentially very dangerous. It's already massively costly in human terms, and some sort of way has to be found out. The one thing to say, and this is very much a sort of, if you like, a guesswork, it's quite probable that if, in other words, if Russia and Putin aren't pushed too far, then eventually it will be recognized within more and more of the senior echelons within the Kremlin that a way has to be found out and that it has to be some sort of negotiations. Once that happens, they're in a different ballgame, because then there is all sorts of professional competence in the UN and elsewhere as to how you do this kind of mediation. And there's plenty of experience of this as well. We tend to forget this, that, I mean, I've worked most of my career at peace studies. Many of our students have gone to work on post-conflict peace building, working in many of the previous conflict zones, but it can take a very long time. I mean, the consensus, I think, among people who really are either from Northern Ireland or know it well, think that you're talking about a half a century to get a really lasting peace, and we're only halfway there. Now, imagine the impact of what has happened in Ukraine on the willingness of Ukrainians to actually go for a longer term peace. And there's going to be very little belief in faith in Russia for some time to come, and that's another cost. So there are real difficulties, but on the other hand, there's huge experience and it can be done. And that's the key thing. We need, I think, to remember that to get this sense of perspective.
Well, there is something following directly on from what you just said. Libby wrote, given the number of things Putin has said and then gone back on, how is any peace agreement going to be possible? How can Ukraine be sure Russia won't regroup and attack again in 6 to 12 months?
I think, Libby, you're quite right. I mean, that is one very big issue, and it will be, to some extent, the issue of trust. On the other hand, again, there's a huge wealth of experience in how you actually get things to have some sort of lasting impact. It's been done in many other conflicts in different parts of the world. So you're not coming to this completely fresh. But essentially, I agree with you very much. This is going to be particularly difficult to do. And an awful lot of this is about really small steps. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy announced unilaterally that the United States would give up atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, a big issue. Now, fair enough, they'd just done a lot of them. They didn't need to do any in the short term, but he said this was unilateral and it was permanent. The Russians did not, the Soviets did not reply directly, but they basically announced, apparently in a disconnected way, that they were ceasing the production of a particular nuclear bomber early. And then the Americans made another stepped forward without a direct offer, and the Russians responded. And in the space of about 5 or 6 months, tensions eased hugely, and you began that period in the middle and late 60s, which is one of the areas where you did have a degree of arms control. It ended up with the Outer Space Treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Treaty of Tlatelolco on Latin America, and the rest. So in other words, it was I think the Turkeys, if I remember rightly, the sociologist by the name of, I think it was Robert Osgood, who coined this term, graduated and reciprocal reductions in tension. In other words, they're reciprocal in a sense, but they're not directly comparable. And so in other words, you build trust in a slow way. But I'm bound to agree that this one is going to be extremely difficult to get to because of how deep it has gone and the huge amount of atrocities and the rest have been committed.
We've got 2 questions from Bernard and Rosemary on coups in Russia. What are the chances of Putin being removed from within? And from Rosemary, in due course, is there any possibility of a coup within Russia? And if so, who would be a key likely successor to Putin? I think the same question came up last time.
Yes. I think there is always some chance. But the problem is, do you get somebody worse? Now, it's difficult to say that, but it's certainly possible. There are indications, and I think these are beginning to firm up, that Putin's actual health is not good. Lots of wild rumors, but I think more than that, there may be some substance in this. That could mean that he will want some sort of conclusion, so that basically he can get out of it with a strong degree of reputation intact in terms of how he can present it, which may be rather different, to put it politely, from how the rest of the world sees it. There is the possibility of some sort of takeover, particularly if at any stage Putin himself tends to be pretty weakened. The problem is that, as so often happens with this kind of regime, anybody who would have been a likely direct takeover potential has been sidelined. And so many such people are basically long since way away from the levers of power. There are still some pretty strong people around, including the Minister of Defense, but he's really in a suspect position at present, and 1 or 2 of the senior intelligence people. It is possible that the military itself, at the senior officer level, may say enough is enough. So it may not be in the form of a coup, but it may be basically an internal ultimatum to Putin, is that the losses are too great, we can't hold the armed forces together, particularly the army, and we need to negotiate. And that might be a safer way rather than hoping for a coup, because apart from anything else, I mean, it's a variation of that phrase about revolutions. Revolutions merely change the accents of the elites. And in a coup, you are often replacing one particular group for another, which may be a little bit different, but basically is of a similar kind.
There's another military question I'm going to raise, which is, Graham, what do you think would have been the position now if NATO countries had not sent any weapons?
I think probably you would have actually found a very bitter war with the Ukrainians suffering a lot worse, but not necessarily with the Russians being able to take over the whole country. And there would have been a huge demand from public opinion in the Western world to intervene in some way. But I think if NATO hadn't intervened at all, given the circumstances in Ukraine, probably non-violent resistance would not have been amenable on the scale that is required. You can't say that for sure. It's very much a what if, but I think that may be fairly realistic. So I think basically the situation within Ukraine would be probably a lot worse than it is now. But you can't be sure, because at the same time, the more NATO puts forces in, and there's a heck of a lot going on at present, the more longer this war will last. And it's possible that, you know, if the Russians had basically taken over much of Ukraine, they would have been worn down instead themselves in the coming years. But that would have been at a huge human cost, I have to say. But it's a real, I'm really speculating here. And I'm sure there's many opinions among the group of us here as I might have on this.
There's a couple of questions to do with food. Julia, what would be key strategies now to avoid or lessen the danger of famine in vulnerable parts of the world? Mary, how could the UN ensure grain can be exported from Ukraine?
the second one first, but you have to remind me of the other one. I'll probably forget it, I'm afraid. The point here is, I think that it's very difficult to see how it can be got out of Ukraine. The Russians are claiming that they would let it out, but able to do that, you would have to have safe maritime routes, which means removal of the mines. Now, the mines were placed largely by the Ukrainians to prevent the Russians doing landings, particularly in the area of Odessa and to the sort of the west of Crimea. I think the blunt thing is that the Ukrainians do not trust the Russians if they get rid of those mines. It's as blunt as that. That does not mean there might be some sort of way forward, but Putin has always said he would not allow grain out of Ukraine through the Black Sea route unless sanctions were eased on Russia. Now, there's always some room for maneuver here. And the very fact that, you know, people like the Russian foreign minister even talking about the possibility is maybe a slight indication. You may be clutching at straws, but you can't be sure. But at the moment, the prospects do not look good. On the wider issue, the first question, well, there's no easy way out except to remember this basic thing. And this takes me back I first got involved in development activism sort of in the very early 70s, in fact, late 60s, and was very much sort of watching it when the world food crisis developed. At the peak of that crisis, which was in August, September 1974, world grain reserves, which are the key indicators, were half the normal level. But the world never ran out of food per se. What it did run out of, poorer people having the money to pay for the more expensive food. And that, I think, is the reality. Even now, if the worst comes to the worst, and the supplies to Ukraine are not available this year, the world does not have to see people starve on a huge scale, because there will be grain around in different places, but people won't be able to afford to buy it. And that's the key thing you have to remember. The idea that the world runs out of food is not going to happen soon. Longer term, under climate breakdown, I'm not going to say. But in the short term, it does come back to a large extent to economics. And with grain prices going through the roof, for many people in the world, whereas sort of 6 months ago they could afford to eat, now many of them can't. That is especially true across the global south.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of the hour. I'm going to ask a question from Peace News staffer Emily Johns. How can we support the Russian peace movement?
It's not an area I can help on. When you ask a question you can't answer, let's just say it at the start. But there is a Russian peace movement. There are people who in Russia, I have Russian friends who are currently in Britain who are bitterly opposed to what Putin is doing. And they say there are many other people like them. But the repression is so much that it needs a very brave person. I remember in the first week or so of the war, something like 15,000 people in Russia were arrested, and many of them treated extremely badly. Some of them in detention long term, others short term. It took a lot of bravery to do that. But I think, Emily, there'll be other people in and around Peace News, and particularly people who are specialists in public action, who can answer it better than I can. So I won't pretend I can. Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to say a last word, Paul. I'll just respond to one thing that's happened in the chat, which was a plea, which I very much feel, to reschedule our June the 18th event, because it is the day of the big TUC march in London. Unfortunately, due to the complexities of the various calendars of the Ziegler 4, we have to stay with the June the 18th, but of course, we will record it and it will be available afterwards for folk who go on the march, which, Peace News staffers will be on the march as well. So I apologize for that conflict. It's something that we can't avoid. So Paul, is there a last word that you'd like to say, something that we haven't managed to cover that you think is worth saying in your last word in this particular call? I don't know, Mill. I mean, there's not much more that can be. I don't know how I can sort of draw it together. We have to face the fact it's a particularly difficult time. In many ways, things are moving backwards on the arms control side and the rest, on the militarism side. I suppose all I can say is a rather bland thing. more than ever now, this is when we really have to rethink what we mean by security. And I will give a plug for the Alternative Security Review, rethinkingsecurity.org. Oh, yeah, one small thing. I know Richard Reeve and I have just done a thing for Rethinking Security. It's on their web, which basically tries to summarize where things are with the war and looks wider, Richard particularly looking wider at the human security dimension. It's only about 3,000 words, and it might be just helpful for people who sort of want to follow up from what we've been talking about tonight. But I think groups like that and groups like Peace News become even more important at this time. So all power to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for sharing this hour with us. I'm sure everyone has found it very informative, as I have done, certainly. And so thank you very much for being with us and sharing that with us. And I'll thank everyone for coming. I'm sorry we didn't manage to get to all of the questions, but we did get to most of them. So thank you very much for coming, everyone. And that's it for this particular update from Paul Rogers.
Thank you.